This morning there's been lots of really great conversations, I think. There's the vocabulary used in this event I find really evolves year by year. So this morning there was a lot of talk of landscape level initiatives. That's more the case than I've seen in the past, I think. Biodiversity is rightly becoming front and center. Carbon has been there for a long time and remains there. There were some really nice discussions around optionality, which has been surfacing again and again during the conversations we've had. The transition from a linear to a circular vision of the economy and the important place that biomass plays in there. So loads of interesting aspects being discussed. Evolution of language, I think that's really encouraging. Our panel is titled Forestry, Agroforestry and the March to Net Zero. There's quite a lot in there. We've got our own angle on this, and we're going to unpack a few aspects of it. I'm really happy to see agroforestry front and center there in particular. We've got a particularly biodiverse panel, if I could say it that way, to help us with these topics. We have got a forester, we've got a representative of a large corporate, we've got an investor, and we've got a value chain advisory specialist. So in this panel, we've got really representatives of some of the key, or all of the key, I think, actors to help us to sort of really do a good job of unpacking it. I will ask them to introduce themselves in a second, but starting on my left, we've got Nadine Stueber, who's the sustainability manager, or a sustainability manager at Nestlé. We've got Nikol Ostianova, development lead at Treevaluation. We've then got John Ambler, Associate Director at Pollination, and Domenico Iannidinardo, Senior VP and Chief Forester at Mosaic Forest Management. So those are the very quick summaries. I'm going to start at the far end, please, and just ask Domenico to introduce himself and the business in a little bit more detail, please, and then we'll come back this way.
Yeah, thank you very much, Martin. Indeed, my name is Domenico Iannidinardo. I'm the Senior Vice President, Forest and Climate and Chief Forester at Mosaic Forest Management, and great pleasure to be here with everyone in person and online, and my esteemed colleagues here to talk about agroforestry and really just to appreciate all the effort they're working on to really repair the climate. And certainly today we've heard that the core is still about repairing climate, but we've learned a lot about the other features that can be improved with society and environment generally along the way. Recently, Mosaic Forest Management made a big change by delivering on the Big Coast Forest Climate Initiative. A bit of history on Mosaic. Its mandate for the first 110 years of its existence has really been to grow the best trees and deliver the finest logs to the nicest customers. Well, that changed in our operating area on the far west coast of Canada just a few weeks ago when we got issued through Verra. Our Big Coast Forest Climate Initiative is a result of removing 40,000 hectares of mainly old, original forest from our harvest plans and reduce our timber harvesting level significantly. So 20 million tons of greenhouse gases will be removed and avoided over the life of this project, while also assuring customers and our Indigenous partners that crucial and tangible co-benefits will persist on this land and also be propagated beyond the boundaries of the project in terms of time and space. So we look forward to talking about that here in more detail today and celebrating how we've managed to put together the Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas Partnership with revenue sharing through these 20 million credits, as well as celebrating and saluting Verra for allowing the option of group project to enable small forest owners and smaller Indigenous timberland owners to more readily join the carbon market by reducing their costs on the validation step and therefore really make it more accessible to more owners in and around the Pacific Northwest of North America.
Thanks. My name is John. Thank you. My name is John Ambler, and I'm an associate director with Pollination. Pollination is a relatively young organization. We're about 3 years old, and today about 200 people across Australia, London, and the United States. And we really have three pillars to our business. We have an advisory business that works with corporates and governments and financial institutions to navigate the transition to a net zero and nature positive world. And we also have a series of investment platforms, in particular a JV with HSBC that invests across nature and carbon markets. The third piece of our business is a project development and incubation business. That's where I sit. And through that work, we work on large-scale infrastructure-style afforestation, reforestation projects. In particular, we have a flagship project in Pakistan that operates on about 600,000 hectares of land, reforesting the Sindh River Delta. My background is as a project developer, so I definitely have some dirt under my fingernails, and I'm excited for the conversation today.
Thank you. Nikol?
Thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Nikol Ostianova, and I'm the founder and the development lead at Treevaluation. We are a insetting program development organization. We support companies such as Nestlé in developing programs for transition of smallholder agriculture value chains, mostly in Africa, towards more regenerative practices. I've been asked today to also explain what insetting mean. Is there anybody in the room who does not know what insetting mean as opposed to offsetting? Okay. Okay. Well, not that anybody will do so. So, insetting basically means that you are actually decarbonizing your own value chain via, for example, agroforestry. So, definitely to answer from my side the question of the session's title today, yes, agroforestry is one of the key elements of how to reach net zero, especially for agricultural companies. And what we do is we support companies in developing their commitments into investable roadmaps, so basically translating commitments into coherent, concerted efforts, because what we see today on the market is a lot of great projects, but they are mostly isolated projects, and mostly companies don't yet know how to really reach their science-based targets or other targets they have. And we also do, payment for environmental services, structure design, smallholder farming, technical assistance design, as well as the overall community and farmer approach in terms of reaching mostly permanence, because that's one of the topics I wanted to cover today. In smallholder farming landscapes, risks are huge, so it was great to hear today all the topics in the forestry space, how risk can be mitigated. In the agricultural value chains, we see huge risks, and they range from everything which has been mentioned today, plus things around farmers' acceptance overall to engage in agroforestry. Not everybody is convinced that it's a great idea. We see more and more that it is becoming acceptable for farmers because, for example, 70% of the cocoa belt, which is in West Africa, will not be suitable for cocoa without interventions by 2050. So that's one of the things. And maybe second point I would like to mention is the overall business case for companies to engage in transitional programs towards regenerative agriculture. Nadine will speak more in detail about that, but we mostly see that there is willingness to invest. However, most of the land is actually not owned by companies who source from these regions, so there is a bit of a disconnect into who's actually supposed to pay. So we are also tackling that in our programs, and mostly we see, again, as opposed to offsetting, there is a great opportunity for actual sharing financial burden of insetting programs, because unlike carbon credits used for offsetting purposes, the carbon assets used for insetting do not have to be passed on only one buyer. So that's a good benefit.
Thank you. And last but not least, Nadine.
Hello, everyone. I'm Nadine Stueber. So yes, I'm a sustainability manager at Nestlé. I'm part of the corporate ESG team. And so we have a net zero objective. The aim is to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030 and then reach net zero by 2050. And like we heard just before with Bayer, of course, one of our biggest emissions is linked to scope 3, and so emissions from the agricultural sector. And so, of course, we implement activities to reduce emissions. But personally, I work a lot on a program that's called the Global Reforestation Program, and it's really focused on implementing removals projects, so mainly trees, within our supply chain. So we have a program that's aimed at planting 20 million trees every year for the next 10 years, so 200 million trees by 2030 within our supply chain. So insetting. We look at projects that are specifically agroforestry focused, so really with the farmers where we source, for example, coffee or cocoa from, but also a little bit broader at a landscape level, so restoring lands around the areas where we source our main commodities.
Great, thank you. Okay, good. So I think the scene is set. You can see who we've got on the panel here. I'm going to start the conversation around the social end of things a little bit. It's been mentioned a few times this morning. It hasn't been maybe unpacked as much as some of the other subjects we've come to or had discussed this morning. So I'd like to start with that side of things. And I'm going to come to you first, John, I think, on this one. As an investor, that's your perspective here. Where does one set the cursor in an optimal way as regards community benefit sharing to make sure the investment performs as well as possible and that it is I suppose, a net benefit to the project as a whole?
Thanks for the question. I think I might reframe it a little bit because I think oftentimes people get kind of they choose to focus more on kind of the number than on the process. And I think that really when you talk about community benefit sharing, the key message there is that it needs to be done in response to the community's needs and through integration of communities into the project design itself. And so that really means working with communities as owners and participants in the project from the very beginning to address the challenges that they may face, and then to build a project that's responsive to those challenges. And I think that when projects do a good job of that, it can look very different for different projects. So, for instance, our project in Pakistan, there are very limited government services, and so they need substantial capex investment in things like schools and medical clinics. Whereas potentially an agroforestry project where the project is being implemented on smallholder land, perhaps cash payments are a more appropriate form of benefit sharing. And so really I think you have to look at the kind of the context in which you're operating. But good benefit sharing programs can both create price uplift from the carbon offsets themselves, as well as increase permanence by reducing the pressure on the forests and on the areas around the project.
Okay, great, thanks. And I think that leads us nicely, Domenico, into perhaps your perspective as a forester on a similar kind of subject. As I recall, indigenous community benefits are a core part of the work you're doing and the way you format your project. So perhaps you can just explain how that works in the projects you're...
Yeah, very much so. Thanks, Martin, and a great example there, John. Certainly with the Big Coast Forest Climate Initiative, the investment for this project comes from our two owners, the Canadian Public Sector Pension Plan and the British Columbia Investment Management Corporation. And it comes with a mandate to do more than store carbon or avoid emissions. And one manifestation of that was through the extension partners that we brought along for this project and helped with the design and will be helping us to maintain the project. One is called the Pacific Salmon Foundation, so revenue sharing from the sale of these credits will go to support climate research in the marine environment on the west coast of North America. And also, a new type of partner is the one we have with the Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas Program of Canada. So this is unique. Revenue that we make from selling these carbons will be shared with them to set up a research shop and promote Indigenous values into the planning of our project, but also to help expand this project beyond its current form. So the instances that can be formed with our new group project option could involve many First Nations who don't have quite enough scale to start their own project. And then take that, add instances, and then study these 40,000 hectares that we currently have and look for more cultural history, more medicinal plants and medicines that maybe haven't been discovered in these regions yet for them in these areas, and put that to work in their communities. And Indigenous culture on the west coast of North America really revolves around forests and trees. Many of their clothes and their cultures revolve around red cedar. They have cultural bathing places and so on. So this is helping reintroduce that and revitalize that within those communities.
Okay, thanks. And in the work you've done, have there been any particular lessons learned that are interesting to discuss?
Sure. Well, this is 6 weeks since we've been issued, and I encourage everybody to keep the faith. Verra did issue our credits, and we're in market now. Certainly, the concept of carbon credits is something that most people don't really think about. Everyone in here thinks about. So we took a lot of time before this project went to validation and verification to meet with the 30 different First Nations whose territories intersect with our project, and look for their advice on the way into the project and before we submitted to the registry, and of course set up a structure so that there's ongoing feedback and annual meetings with the revenue sharing.
Okay, great, thanks. Let's bring it back to the corporate context a little bit, Nadine, and also I think probably more into an agroforestry context than the last example. In the context of insetting, which is a major part of your work, the social component, I guess, is a key part, but what are the other components that need to be there to make the projects you're involved in really transformative?
So of course for us, since it's within our supply chain, that's really one of the big focuses. We try to really develop the project within our supply chain. So in some areas we know exactly where we source, for example, our coffee from, and so we can develop projects specifically tailored for the areas, for example, with coffee farmers in Colombia or in Mexico. I think it's very important that we develop these projects specifically for the local context. So it's not there's one size fits all. We really develop these projects with project implementers that know the local context on the ground. We also take into consideration, of course, aspects such as biodiversity, and so develop planting trees that are linked to also the local context in a way, but it's also interesting for the farmers. So oftentimes they can choose, for example, the types of species they want to plant, taking into consideration the biodiversity, but also other aspects. So maybe in some areas they're more interested in timber trees because there is a timber supply chain, or it might be because they're more interested in fruit trees because either they use it for consumption or they can sell it. So I think a big part is really making sure that we talk to the communities from the beginning to make sure that they are interested. And most of these projects also, well, in all of these projects, we only do them with the farmers that are actually interested. So it's their decision to participate in a project. And so, since we plant 20 million trees per year, so 200 million by 2030. And so we have agroforestry projects, so they're really on farm. But then we also have, of course, landscape restoration projects. So there it also depends on the context. If there is an area where there needs restoration of a hill next to maybe a coffee farm, or it makes sense to do connections. Those are things that we implement depending on how the context is on the ground.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to come to you now, Nikol. But if panelists want to comment on questions I'm asking to one panelist, feel free to jump in at any point, or wave your hand at me. Nikol, it's related, but it's not exactly the same thing. So if we kind of think about the kind of, and I do like the title, The March to Net Zero. I'm not sure we're quite on a march to net zero yet, are we? But I think some of the panelists here might suggest a slightly faster pace is needed to really get somewhere meaningful. But if we just think about the carbon aspect here a little bit, and if we accept that consumer choices actually are what drives many things here in the end, how can the owner of a commodity-oriented consumer business connect the question of emissions with actual purchasing behavior that's going on in retail contexts and other purchasing decision-making contexts?
Yeah. Well, we know that a lot of consumers are environmentally and socially aware. Not many of them want to pay a premium for it. There is a percentage of consumers who do, but it's not enough to move the market yet. The communication is becoming also, from the compliance perspective, a bit more difficult because, for example, the EU is on march to ban climate neutrality and carbon neutrality claims, so something which has been still easily communicated to consumers, although it has been associated with a lot of greenwashing accusations, will also not be possible. So we see that a lot of brands are going on sort of transparent storytelling. So rather than putting a claim on a box, It will be telling stories, because that's also what people can emotionally connect with. And that's where actually the change happens. It's not in the brain, but it's in the guts and in the heart. So that would be one thing. At the same time, I think that at some point we will see that claims around for regenerating forests, also things around less child labor, which is associated with a lot of communities, will be relevant, because those are topics actually which consumers do care about. So, and then of course the link to carbon. We'll need a little bit of bridge and still a little bit of education, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. No, good. And I'm going to stay on the same topic here. We're going to stay at the consumer end here. I'm going to come back to you, Nadine. It's a similar kind of question, really, but in your insetting projects that you're, I guess, designing and also implementing, how can you most effectively communicate what they're achieving to the consumer?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. So I think the reason why we developed this program is, of course, due to a carbon vision, right? We have this net zero objective, and these programs are going to help us specifically with our science-based target flag objectives. And so it's really to get these removals. But as we just heard, that's not really what the consumers might be most interested in. And I think it's also it doesn't say that much if we have I know a chocolate bar, and before it was this much carbon and now it's this much. Who really knows what it means? So I think from our side, what we try to do is we talk really more about what the program is doing, or what each project is doing on the ground. So talking about the number of trees that we have planted and we're aiming to plant and grow, talking about the biodiversity aspect, talking about the communities that we work with. I think just bringing the projects more alive, which are much more than just carbon. The carbon is maybe the reason why we decided to finance them, but I think there's so much more that we can talk about. And like we just heard, I think that's also something that people can connect with. They can connect with the stories from the farmers, and I think it makes much more sense. And I think it goes far beyond just these projects. It's like we said, transparency, also about sustainable sourcing, or about different types of subjects that we can talk about. Maybe it's not so much, it's much harder to talk about that on packaging, but it can be done on websites, or with QR codes or things like that that provide a little bit more insights into these projects. And maybe also talking about the difficulties that, okay, we want to plant 20 million trees, but it takes a long time. These are 20-year projects, so what are we doing on the ground? How are we implementing this? Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. We're going to switch gear now, but any other comments on the sort of social end of things from the panelists at this point?
I would just add that making it tangible and visible in terms of most people's perception of good by having, in Nadine's case, examples of where people can see the 20 million trees that are being planted. We do a lot of that at Mosaic, but also with Big Coast Forest Climate Initiatives as an example, nations can come out, they can select totem logs under the protocol without invalidating anything. It's all part of the SDGs that are connected to our program. If they need canoe logs, it's all out there. And when they walk into an original primary forest on a hot summer day and realize it's 15 degrees cooler in there and everything is working just fine, it's a type of appreciation that is hard to imitate on paper or greenwash.
Excellent. Okay, good. Well, let's say switch gear a little bit. We can come back to this topic in the questions at the end. We've got about 10 minutes before I'm going to come to the audience for questions, so please start thinking about questions. But if we switch gear a little bit to more project design and how projects are formatted, John, I'm going to come to you on this one. This morning, there's been, as I said, landscape is becoming a mainstream feature of the dialogue we have in this room now. In the past, it was more on focused project design, slightly more monocultural ideas and concepts that were more center stage. But as an investor, John, here, do you prefer, and maybe it's too simple a way to ask the question, but do you prefer to see projects that come into you which are actually quite concentrated and monocultural, or do you prefer to see things which are inherently more variegated, include different types of land use, or do you have no preference? It'd be interesting just to hear your perspectives on that.
Well, I think I've talked to a lot of consultants in the room today, so I'm going to give you a consulting answer, which is, it depends. But I think in terms of kind of the centralized projects, those projects are able to often scale quite quickly if they have a centralized delivery and kind of project execution capacity. And oftentimes, because of precedents through infrastructure projects, for instance, and PPPs, there's the capacity to deal with government in a more digestible way for governments than for some of these kind of more mosaic projects. So I think in the kind of logistical and government relations sense, a centralized project can have real kind of benefit there. But on a more mosaic project with smallholders, the capacity to deliver impact and co-benefits is unquestionable. I know we've seen projects that for every dollar invested in them have $8 or $9 of audited benefits to the farmers themselves. And then in addition, that kind of decentralized approach from an investment perspective really manages risk, whether that's physical risk from fires or floods or pest, as well as social risk of land tenure issues, expropriation, things like that. So I'd say when we look at investments, we're trying to think, what is our risk appetite? What are the problems that we're trying to solve for? As well as, what is the impact that we want to achieve from these projects? And I think maybe just one kind of more point on this, something that I think is a really kind of underappreciated opportunity, both from a sustainable development and from a kind of a climate change perspective, is the ability to kind of to harness and to incorporate smallholders into the conversation, which is work that I think everyone on this panel is working towards. Yep. FAO says there are about 500 million smallholders and about 2 billion people at a household level who are directly benefiting from smallholder farming. And if those people are able to participate in carbon markets and insetting approaches and all of the different ways that they can increase their farms' both productive capacity and capacity to sequester carbon, that is a massive, massive opportunity to fight climate change and to improve some of the poorest communities around the world. So I think all of us here in the room can kind of work on and focus on incorporating those people into the conversation.
Great, thank you. And maybe Nadine, just you have a different context. You're looking at this from a corporate angle. The way you think about investments is not quite the same as Pollination would think about it. But how do you see that question of kind of project focus versus more landscape level formatting of projects? Do you have a view on it, preferences?
So I think Nestlé is very big and we have a very big objective, so we have to do both. We have landscape approaches and we have project approaches. Specifically on the Global Reforestation Program, it's probably more of a project approach, but there are certain projects that do also landscape type of restoration. But the idea is, of course, also to work with potentially other companies or other organizations to develop something at a landscape level. Of course, this is sometimes a bit harder to implement, but in the end, the impacts can be much bigger and you can reach much more people. So I think the idea is really to work a little bit on both and see what makes sense. If we have a project and we can potentially scale it up to something more landscape level, we try to do that where it's appropriate.
Okay, and for the various kinds of projects that both of you see, do you have, if we think about the different components, profitability, impact, environmental aspects, social aspects, are you able to apply different lenses depending on the type of project that comes in? This is a general question to the panel, I suppose. It's anybody who'd like to comment on this is very welcome. But how do you modulate, if you like, expectations on the different types of return you could get? Vis-a-vis the way the project looks when it comes to you. Anyone would like to comment on that?
Well, go ahead.
Please go ahead.
I think from a corporate point of view, specifically, so if you do something to reach our net zero objective, we follow, of course, SBTi and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, for example, and there it's very clear that for those kinds of objectives, we can only take into consideration everything that's directly on farmland where we source certain commodities from, and that kind of restricts us in some ways for the carbon. However, at Nestlé, we believe that since we have an impact on the community as a whole when we source from that area, we would also like to develop projects more at a landscape level and so more holistically. And so I would say everything that's very on farm is maybe there's more of a carbon vision to it, but of course we take into consideration the biodiversity, the social aspect as well, whereas if we look at it from a landscape level, it might be more due to pillars like deforestation or biodiversity or working at a watershed. So it's less carbon focused, but still nature focused, I would say.
Great. Nikol, go ahead, yeah.
I will add to that from sourcing company point of view. What is very critical is yield per hectare. So what you're actually trying to do is to a certain extent either at least to stabilize the yield by implementing agroforestry, or you are likely to reach a more diversified yield because you're growing more crops. So you will be looking at projecting the income at the farmer level because that still has to be sexy for the farmer to, well, plant a tree and grow a tree over at least 20 years' time. And as Nadine says, the carbon piece in the commodity or the agriculture commodity space is really the unit everybody speaks, but it's not the core what drives the value in the end.
Yes, go ahead, John. Yeah.
Maybe if I can just build on both of those points too. I think that certainly we look, as you'd imagine, at kind of economic returns as well as the impact that we're trying to drive. But I think a key kind of third pillar too is the kind of the ecosystem services and the benefits that exist kind of beyond the boundaries of the project. And that today the market doesn't really have the right tools to value and to monetize in a predictable way. And so one of the things that I think we're really interested in exploring is whether it's through insurance or through other tools, how do we actually identify that value, make sure that we're measuring it, and then that we're finding ways to monetize the value beyond just the kind of the carbon and the biodiversity markets that exist today.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just add that our investors were comfortable with proceeding with this project if it was worth at least as much as the typical timber processes we would have done. But the way it's come through with being such a immediate large amount of credits with all these co-benefits, it certainly has become a premium product that companies that are looking to really address their footprint fast can rely on. So we've sold half of our project already, and it's been to those companies who are committed to the long term but really want to expedite their neutrality. So we're there for them, and our investors are comfortable with that approach.
Yeah, great. And this it's a fascinating area, but it was talked about a bit this morning. Carbon credits are relatively well understood these days. They've been around for a long time. There's been some methodologies that have been questioned in some markets recently, which has created some waves. Biodiversity and other ecosystem services credits are still somewhat less clearly defined. Value is attached to them, but in a voluntary context more than anything else. We haven't talked, or I've not heard much discussed about the quality of carbon credits. So what I see in some of the projects I look at is that corporates in particular are willing to buy credits for a higher price from projects they consider to be high quality, for example, in terms of its biodiversity characteristics. So the quality, if I can use that word, of carbon credits is something that's relevant in voluntary markets in particular. I want to stay on the theme of carbon just for a second, because the credibility, the value credibility is key. And Nikol, I think this is something which you do some work with here in the smallholder value chains that you are focused on to some extent. But can you give some examples of how in the projects you're working on that credibility question around carbon can be achieved? Be really interesting.
It's actually a mosaic of what has been already mentioned. So it's mostly the community/farmer engagement in the design of the project. It will definitely be some guidance in terms of how much value, it does not have to be cash, but how much value should be passed on to those communities. So we would be sort of advising to at least stick to what the Plan Vivo voluntary standard advises, and that's around 60% of a carbon credit value, which is the only voluntary carbon standard which has a recommendation on that. And then it would be, of course, a robust MRV. And there, especially because most of these projects are mosaic type of projects, clustered projects, you need to be particularly creative. So there we would be looking at either real measurement in field when it comes to biodiversity, soil carbon through soil samples, and biomass. Yes, companies say, oh, that's going to be sold by remote sensing technology in a couple of years. Yes, but actually, I'm still surprised that companies are comfortable with the level of inaccuracy which we're seeing today on the market. And it would be a verification as opposed to certification. So we would be looking at verification of outcomes on an annual or at least biannual basis, at least on a sample which would be, now we're getting very technical, but on a sample basis which would respect 95% to 5%. Yeah.
Okay, so it's a very scientific aspect to what you're just describing.
Yeah, because in the end it is partly science. So carbon measurement, you can only get the precise carbon in a tree if you fell down the tree, which is not your primary target in the end. So you still rely on models to a certain extent. But again, I will echo what has been mentioned today. We need to move to more action. So I think that we also need to be a little bit sort of generous with ourselves in the process.
Great, thank you. And there is another actor here which is very important sitting behind this conversation, which has been referred to this morning in several panels, but the importance of government and decisions made at government level, policies, regulations that are put in place. I'm going to have some questions for the panel on that in a second, or we're just going to talk about that in a second. But before I do that, audience questions. We've got about 10 minutes left, but are there some questions that are stimulated by what's been discussed so far? If so, there's a couple over here, yeah, please.
Hi everyone, Katrin Harding from BP. Question around the sort of share of carbon revenues going back to communities, which absolutely critical to the success of projects, but quite interested around, you mentioned a 60% kind of threshold, but I think we're relatively more familiar with that from the kind of REDD+ model where it is really community-led actions. But when looking at the more afforestation, reforestation, agroforestry model, where also the costs of the project are just much, much higher, be very interested if you could speak a little bit to how you kind of build up that calculation of what the benefits to communities actually are.
Thank you for that question. I do definitely agree. So, for example, as Nadine mentioned, farmers do receive seedlings and further technical assistance, which should be part of that revenue sharing model. So that's why I also said it should not be only cash, but also in kind, as long as it's also viewed as a value for the farmer. And obviously then you're still looking at quite high costs for the MRV piece and for any carbon generating piece if you're generating carbon credits. What makes the insetting programs, well, sexy, but a little bit more blurred today is that if voluntary carbon markets are criticized today, insetting carbon programs are just being targeted or just being started to criticize because with the methodologies around, they do follow the path of carbon credits markets, but they are not that well defined. And we see that they're slowly coming closer together because voluntary carbon standards want to avoid the shitstorm they're getting for carbon credits today. But yeah, so I would see that the big portion of that sale or of that value still needs to go to MRV and transparency. And obviously, yes, there is margin for project developers and sales.
John.
I think I might just add that certainly for some project types that have substantial kind of upfront, capex costs, potentially looking more at a profit-sharing model. If the kind of the investment into the project is made by a constellation of the stakeholder groups, a profit-sharing model as opposed to a revenue-sharing model can also work really well.
Great. There was another question here, I think. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. Anna Lehman with Wildlife Works. I feel one stakeholder is probably missing on this panel, which is communities. I think you refer to them a lot, which is great, thank you. I have a quite a broad question to the panel, more reflecting on what your observation is. We work with communities around the world, and one of the reasons why we see a lot of skepticism and criticism towards getting them involved in the carbon market is a fear also that this might drive further land acquisition and concentration. Just a reflection from your end, is that something you feel in the spaces you work in? Thank you.
So the question is, could the carbon markets work against the social interest? Is that the question?
Yeah, or actual drivers. You know, I think certainly under the SBTi guidance and the requirement for companies to offset Scope 1 emissions with Scope 1 removals is a direct driver towards driving acquisitions. And I think that's what most communities around the world, including here in the UK, are hugely afraid of.
Okay. Who'd like to have a go at that one?
I can speak from the coast of North America, the west coast, that the carbon markets have lifted the value of many indigenous-owned timberlands and indigenous-owned timber rights. So from that perspective, which is the one I have, it's all positive at the moment in terms of that optionality and the granularity David spoke about earlier becoming real for existing owners. Yes, it does increase the price for new acquisitions and maybe reduces the amount of hectares that they might be able to purchase per dollar in the future, but they'll be more efficient with the lands they have and share that information with other communities as they consider what to do.
Okay. Anybody else? Other questions from the audience? There's one at the front here, I think. Yeah. I think we need the microphone just so we can hear what you've... Oh, there's one there, is there?
Jenny. Put your hand up, other questions.
There's a gentleman here as well. Yeah.
I just wanted to follow up on John's point about smallholders being
Could you say who you are, please?
Oh, yeah, Jenny Hinman. I'm founder and chairman of Plant Your Future.
Thank you.
You talked about smallholders being such a big kind of important global demographic. And I often use that fact that you quoted, actually. It's a good one. So I suppose my question is, a lot of those smallholders are actually not part of global supply chains, and they're operating the subsistence level, but they would really benefit from agroforestry. And there's a real dearth of financing flowing into them. It's very difficult to get financing into them if they're not organised. So I guess question to you, John, like how could we try and get more money flowing into agroforestry for them? It's so needed, particularly because many of them will be the worst impacted by the impacts of climate change. And then I guess maybe, Nadine, to you, is that something Nestlé, how does that kind of play into the corporate insetting? Is that a demographic we can interact with, or are they actually going to miss out on the opportunities of insetting because they're not part of global supply chains?
It's a great question. I can take the first half of it at least. So I think that there are two kind of key challenges here that we're in the process of trying to solve for. One of them is a technology challenge, and that includes kind of how do you do MRV on a remote smallholder farm very far away from anyone else, as well as payment infrastructure. How do you pay those people for the carbon that they're growing, and basically how do you service somebody in a very remote area? The second one's a business model question. How do you efficiently kind of deliver the program in a decentralized way across a large landscape? I think that both of those are questions that are kind of currently trying to be solved and that need to be solved before large-scale capital can kind of flow into these approaches. But I think that the really interesting opportunity here is that in many of these places, farmers who may never have had a bank account or been to a bank, they have M-Pesa or a different payment app on their phone through their phone company. And they may never have been connected to an electrical grid, but they have a solar panel on their roof now. And so that kind of decentralization is actually creating the infrastructure by which we can invest in farmers to grow carbon with the other crops on their farms and to directly kind of connect them with global markets. So I think the technology question is in a way solving itself, and now we just need entrepreneurs who can come in and build those business models, who can harness that productive capacity in a way that's digestible for a large bank to invest in.
Nadine.
Yeah. And I think from a corporate point of view, yes, of course, kind of the need to implement these kinds of projects to reduce our emissions that are linked to our supply chain makes it very hard to develop, well, if we develop projects that are outside of the supply chain, they're just not counted towards these kinds of objectives. And so there's, in a way, less of an incentive to do so. And I can understand that that is probably hard. I think what could be interesting is that there's still many companies that are offsetting, right, or that are financing projects that are not directly linked to their supply chain. So in a way, try and find a value added between the two. So you have maybe food and beverage companies or companies that have a very big footprint in the agricultural supply chain. They focus on their supply chain, and then the others focus more on things that are outside of other supply chain. And together, this can be supported.
Nikol, do you have a comment? And we'll have to take your question outside, I'm afraid. We're running out of time, but comment from you.
I completely agree with you, Jenny, and I've been following your organization for a while. So I'm also curious how you're actually building the financing model, which I find extremely difficult, completely not actually sustainable. And I'm asking the same question. It's $1 billion question, and nobody has answered that question. There is a team from USAID. They're asking themselves that question. What are they supposed to do with the projects they have been financing for 30 years? And they're still not sustainable. So if anybody in the room has a tip, how to finance this type of transition path of smallholder farmers, which Jenny has just asked about, I would really love to hear it. We're next to the corporate advising. We're just starting a program with community-led regeneration, and that's exactly the topic we're trying to figure out. So we're looking at potential models of global community-led financing, but it would be still kind of individual exchange for a value, but it's not generating carbon credits because those smallholder farmers are not bankable. They don't have a bank account, and I'm sorry that I sort of made the sound of but I slightly disagree that technology is going to solve it. I don't think that technology will solve it. Great. So if anybody has a tip, please come to me and speak to me.
We're under strict instructions not to overrun. The panel members will be delighted to speak with all of you outside the room later, I'm sure. But in the meantime, thank you very much to our panel members for a great discussion. Thank you.